Welcome to the Dadical Podcast. In today's episode, you're going to get an opportunity to hear from a dad who approaches fatherhood from a very different perspective. He's an analytical mind that recognizes patterns, focuses on segmentation, and it's reflected in the way he parents his children. You're also going to learn why fixing weaknesses may not be the best strategy as a dad. I'm excited to introduce you to Dave Cameron. Dave was one of my instructors at the University of Chicago in the Chief Revenue Officer course. What's so impressive about Dave is he had a very successful career leading customer segmentation for Nielsen Company. He left that career to be more present for his children because he cares about the impact that he can have as a father. He's going to share with us his successes as a dad and a couple of moments he'd love to have back, and I'm excited for you to hear his story today. A couple of administrative notes before we dive into the episode. Do you know a dad with a story worth sharing? If you do, I'd love to talk to them. Fill out a contact form at my website, dadicalpodcast.com. In addition, you can follow Dadical Podcast on all the social channels you use. Subscribe, like, and rate the episode so that other dads who are interested in these conversations can find us. Okay, let's get into it. Here's Dave Cameron. Dave, thanks so much for joining the Dadical Podcast. Really excited to have Dave on the podcast today. I met Dave through the University of Chicago. He was one of my instructors. And Dave teaches a class called Predictive Analytics. And one thing that I learned very quickly about Dave is that he thinks very differently than I do. Dave is an analytical thinker, analytical mind. And because of that, I thought it would be really cool to get to know Dave's approach to fatherhood as such an analytical thinker and how that kind of differs from my vision of fatherhood and things like that. And so, Dave, we're excited to get to know you and your background and your journey as a father. Why don't you introduce us to your family? Tell us a little bit more about yourself, and then we'll dive in from there.
Great. Thanks, Seth. Appreciate your invite. I, quickly professionally, as Seth said, I'm I don't know what you'd call it, mainly marketing analytics for the most part. I have a master's degree in it. It's been my career. I've done well. And I have been married for I'll admit 40 years now. I have
Congratulations.
two quote kids. One is 30, the other is 24. And I've been married for 9 years or so before my first child was born. And part of that is I was focused on, I want to do well in my career. I want to, make sure my marriage, we're strong if something happens and all that. And so my first child was born when I was 33. And it definitely changed my life. And I made some decisions throughout with both of my offspring. My daughter is a 30-year-old. My son is a 24-year-old. But both of them are well-adjusted adults who have a good work ethic and are respected within their fields.
Very cool. So Dave, let's back up. I'd love to learn more about your kids and things like that, but I'd love to back up to even when you were growing up. Tell me about your father, or maybe if it wasn't your father, the most impactful father figure that you had in your life.
Yeah, my childhood was interesting because I was an only child. My parents had a rough time having kids. My mom found it tough to get pregnant and everything. And she even said I came along later than they'd hoped. They'd been married for 7 years, which was really unusual in the 1960s, type of thing, and saying, oh, man. But when I was born, see, my parents got married when they were 19. And in reality, I'm not going to complain because I'm here, but they probably shouldn't have. They weren't mature enough, and they ended up going through a divorce when I was young. And I first got moved with my mom because that's what happens, right? You go to the mom. She's the mother figure, and that's what the courts decide what people do. But it really wasn't working out. I was going into adolescence, and I needed that father figure. And so I ended up moving back in with my dad, and he knocked himself out to make sure that I, without having a mother around, that I would grow up to be a well-adjusted adult. And so my actual biological father became much more of a role model at age 11 when my parents divorced and when I moved back in with them than earlier. And it was great because I went through things where when we first started, oh, he's my dad and so on and so on. By the time I was in high school, we were actually having conversations as if I were an adult, and it was great. I had gotten far enough that he was treating me as if I was 25 instead of 15, and talking through explanations. And I just felt that was so valuable. I matured more quickly because of it. And, he was forgiving of mistakes, not to say we didn't have times where we yelled at each other, but that transition, I don't think would have happened if my parents hadn't gotten divorced. And my dad recognized that, at 11 years old when they got divorced, he was still treating me as I was an 8-year-old. By the time I was 15, he was treating me as if I were 25. It's funny. One thing, Seth, I remember to get stories is that I was 19, I think. Yeah, it was between my freshman and sophomore year of college, and I moved back. I was in the dorms, and I came back, and I got a job selling vacuum cleaners. I was trying to make money to get myself through college, and it was miserable. You ever try going door to door sales, and you're doing vacuum
Oh
cleaners?
yeah.
I mean, just think about that. It's like, yeah, it was rough. And when I told my dad I wanted to quit, and I said, well, door to door sales is definitely not for me. He encouraged it, and he says, you're going to work the rest of your life. Take this summer, enjoy. It may be the last time you get to do it. Now, that wasn't necessarily the case, but it certainly was for quite a number of years afterwards. And that kind of pragmatism was really good.
So your dad, you mentioned that your dad talked to you like you were an adult, even when you were younger. How, can you be more specific? Because I'd love to understand that as a dad with a 13-year-old kid at the youngest and a 19-year-old kid at the oldest. Maybe there's some things that we can capture from that as dads of younger children.
Well, one thing I don't want to make it sound like I'm bragging about myself, but since you already talked about University of Chicago, the neighborhood I grew up in was heavily blue collar. It was 5 miles from Ford Motor Company's largest assembly automotive plant in the world. And 50% of the guys on my block, the men, worked for Ford Motor Company as laborers. And I found out when I was like 7 years old that my friends could take a car engine and apart and put it back together, and I couldn't. On the flip side, I was considered smart. And in seventh grade, I they posted. I went to a junior high school, so where I went, elementary school was through sixth grade. Seventh grade, they posted the grade point, and at the first quarter, I was fifth out of a class of 200 people. And I
Hmm.
was like, wow. And my dad recognized that too. So I decided I'm going to shoot for it. Eighth grade, I was number one. And so he actually switched me to a college prep high school. But he explained it to me. He says, look, you come out of here, the high school you're going to go to, most people get jobs on the assembly line when they get out. They play the lowest common denominator. If you want to go to a good college, you want to go to a good university, I'm going to pay, and it's going to be hard, but to switch schools, but you got to knock yourself out. You got to give it your best effort, because if you can make it through there, you might be able to get a college scholarship. You might be able to get through. And, he laid it on the line for me. And he was basically saying, look, I'm putting 10% of my income away for this. This is really important. So don't F it up, was kind of the thing. But he also talked about the benefits on my end that said, look, you're not an assembly line type of person. This could get you into a good college. This could get you a good job afterwards. And he started talking about, gradually talking about careers and stuff like that. But that wasn't all one discussion. This took several over the course of weeks, because you had to, I don't know what's really ingrained thoughts, but it went against what most people did. So you had to gradually work into it.
Man, I love that story because as a dad, it seems like if I'm taking a principle from that story, it's your job as a dad is to recognize the potential that your kids have and where their strengths are and to help them figure out how to magnify those strengths and help them
Oh,
understand their potential.
you nailed it with the strength, Seth. I'll give you an example from my son. My son was a 3.7 student in high school, 93rd, 95th percentile on the ACT, but yet he went to university for 1 year, and now he's working full time because he was also an actor, and he was good. He was the best actor in his high school for the 4 years from his age. And he now has a job full time acting, performing, which is what he really wants. It was his strengths. I mean, one of the stories we come back to is I worked with him when he was in Boy Scouts, and we had about 80 kids in our Boy Scout troop. And the way it would work is you had a meeting that started at 7 and finished at 8:30 with different activities. But when kids were going to get rank advancements, there was a board of parents who would take the kids, interview, talk to them, make sure they were ready for it, and then vote yes or no. Well, sometimes it would run over. And what my son had done at one of these scout meetings was he went through and he basically did a one act, no, that's not improv, in front of solo improv in front of the group. And like he started off, he says, you know, we were working with all these boxes today. Now, I just came back from the zoo and I saw an ox, and then there are multiple of them, and they're oxen. So if I'm working with a box, if the plural of ox is oxen, why isn't the plural box boxen? And he just had everybody eating out of his hand and everything. We talked for a while, and it was like, no, he's not going to be a desk job person. He could do well in sales, but if he's going to, I mean, he would have done okay in sales, but for performing was just so much there. And that's what happened when he was 20 years old. He got a job as a full-time actor, and he's been doing it for 4 years. So when you said play into your strengths, most parents would have said, "Hey, look, you're a 3.7 student. You got the, I did just quick check. You got a 95th percentile on the standardized test. You need to go to a university for 4 years." But that wasn't his. I mean, it sounds like his strengths, but he's 99th percentile for acting. You just got to go there.
And what I'm hearing from both your experience and your experience with your father is you have to be a present dad in order to recognize those things. You've got to be involved to be able to see the strengths that your kids have so that you can help them realize that potential. And what I love about your dad's story too is he said, look, I'm going to invest in you. Like, I'm going to help you accomplish this, but you have a big responsibility in this too. This isn't just handed to you and then you do with it what you will. It's, I'm going to make a deal with you. I'm going to invest in your future and help you magnify your strengths, but you better stick to this standard.
Right.
Awesome. Okay, so we've got a little bit of that in your experience with your son, helping him, encouraging him to focus on his strengths and things like that. Tell me more about how your experience with your father and the impact that he had on your life. How did that shape the type of father that you became?
Well, you hit on one of it is understanding strengths. I think that everybody's different. So if you think back, try to put yourself in my place where you're 8 years old, you're growing up in a neighborhood where everybody's blue collar there, but they take pride in their work. This is a town where we were solid, middle class people worked hard. They took pride in their work, but it was heavily working, again, as laborers at Ford Motor Company. It wasn't necessarily working on the assembly line. Some of them were building stuff, right? And the fact that it was really valued in my neighborhood to take, be able to build a car, take it apart, understand all this. And I couldn't understand it at all. But recognizing that fast forward a few years, I was an all A student in eighth grade, being able to say, hey, everybody's different. There are, how many, I don't know how many people, 330, 350 million people in the US. There's a lot of different jobs. Find one that you plays to your strengths that you can be excellent at. I think that, taking something from below average to above average isn't really the way to go. It's taking something that's good and saying, I can make it great. Right. And then my company will do well, I'll do well, all that kind of stuff. And the same thing, like I said, with my son, it's like understanding that 90th percentile means you're better than 90% of the people at something, 50th percentile means you're better than 50% of the people. What I've learned in parenting and in just, that kind of life in general is that if you're 50th percentile at something, you can work your tail off and maybe make it to 80th. But if you're already 90th, you got a chance to be great. You got a chance to do something where you can be top and really strong in your field. And if you like it so much, the better. So a lot of what we're taught in schools or what some people are taught is, oh, you need to fix your weaknesses. You're an A student in everything, but you're a C student in math. Start doing math. And I tell you, no, just don't go into math. Where you're an A student, focus in that area. I had a student recently who took a programming class from me who was a marketing major, and she was really struggling. And I said, well, don't take the class. You're not going to be a programmer type. But she understood that paid search was falling by the wayside with what was going on in AI long before the rest of us did. And it's like, you're really good there. You need to leverage that and become great. And that's what I couldn't tell that to my kids in those words, but that's the way I approached it with them. And that's the way went back to my story. My dad approached it with me when he realized, oh, Dave's a lot different than most people in this neighborhood. He's really academically focused, albeit he can talk well. So perhaps we're going to really focus on this grades and college prep school and everything. And again, it's one of those things that you can't get across in a 10-minute conversation. In my mind, it has to be evolutionary over years. Does that make sense?
Oh, totally. Well, and the fact of the matter is, you don't just recognize their strengths all at once either. You see them develop, see what works and what doesn't work, and then you help them refine it from there. It reminds me of my 19-year-old son. He's my oldest, and he hated school. And we had high expectations. We were very strict. One year he wasn't able to go on a fishing trip that we went on because he didn't keep above a B average, which was our expectation for him and things like that. But he's the only kid I've had who has pushed back so hard on the academic side of things. And he's a smart kid, but just hated school. And so I wasn't about to encourage him to go to a 4-year university, continuing to do things that he already hated. So he's actually enrolled in trade school and working as an electrical apprentice right now. And with the way things are going, what we've seen in software and a lot of the white collar jobs, blue collar jobs and blue collar opportunities are becoming bigger and bigger. And so I think he's made a great choice, but that's exactly it. We recognize what's going to be good for them, what their personality traits will help lend them to most effectively and things like that. And then we encourage them to double down on those things. And I think he's going to love that career.
Good. Yeah, and as long as you can make a living off of it, and certainly those, as you pointed out, the market is strong in that area. I can't see why you couldn't make a strong living off of it.
Yeah, for sure. So let's talk about how you view your responsibility as a father. It sounds like you had a great example of a dad in your own life. What is your biggest requirement or responsibility as a father?
That was evolutionary too. One of the things that I had when I was a little kid, my mom had got a book called How to Raise a Brighter Child. And it wasn't about how to become a 4.0 student. It was about how to recognize what's going on in the world and how to adjust to it and adapt and all that kind of stuff. And so for me, it was trying to understand their viewpoint and then explain how that would work in the real world. One of the things I think people find it really hard is to get in somebody else's head, right? I actually, back to my professional side, I led consumer segmentation for the Nielsen company globally for many years. And Seth, when you did the introduction, you talked about taking a class in predictive analytics. You probably remember the segmentation example I gave. And the idea was when you get into as an adult, there are different segments of the U.S. and one of them could be like the blue collar town where I grew up in, and very homogeneous. I mean, I don't know anybody out of the parents I grew up with that had a steady white collar job, but everybody that had blue collar jobs, and a lot of them were, some were, like I said, just working on the assembly line, but most of them were more. You needed more trade stuff. But that was totally foreign to 12 miles north of where I was, where it was a heavy, more executive at companies type of thing and stuff like that. And neither could understand where each other came from. And I think one of the reasons it came to me is because I didn't fit in the neighborhood I was. Early on, it was actually more of somewhat almost an inferiority complex because I didn't fit in with everybody else. But later on, when I realized, but I actually can get a steadier job than them with the white collar skills and not be tied to an employer, it worked out better in the long run. And because of that recognition, as a parent, it's the same thing for me is I take the time to understand what my kids are thinking. And then I gradually work towards saying, okay, within that, kind of segmenting in my own mind, how do I help them within that sphere? And an example was when my daughter took up violin lessons. And it was one of the things she thought about. She got into orchestra and stuff like that. And I'm like, okay, let me find out what it's like to be in an orchestra. Let me find out that kind of stuff and learn how to help her become a successful orchestral performer. Now that phase only lasted a couple of years, but it was at least getting through that and deciding, is this something I really like? And at the end of 2 years, she realized, nah, I'd keep it up if I was going to do it for a career, but I'm not going to do that.
What I love about that, though, is it sounds like it's really important to you. If your kid goes down a certain path, you're bought in, and all of a sudden you're learning how to help support her becoming the best orchestral performer that she can be, or whatever the case may be. And so as a dad, you're jumping in and supporting them in whatever it is that they're choosing to pursue.
Right. And then they can come to the realization at some point. So back to my 90th versus 50th percentile type of thing. My daughter realized she wasn't going to be a 90th percentile violin player, but she could be a 50th. And she's like, well, okay, it's a hobby, but I'm not going to spend the time on it I was spending.
Oh, that's cool. It's so interesting as a dad too. Like, so I've got two boys and a girl. My boys are my oldest and my youngest, and my girl's in the middle. And I coach basketball with both of my boys, all growing up, and so it's super easy to get into their stuff. My daughter has been big into dance since she was 4 or 5 years old, and so we've been a dance family for a long time. And I'll be honest, before my daughter got into dance, I had zero interest in dance, and now, like 10 years later, I'm the biggest dance fan there is when it comes to my daughter. I don't particularly enjoy watching other people's kids dance, but I love watching my daughter dance. And it's just funny how, as a dad, you just learn to buy into whatever it is that your kids love to do. And you want to encourage them doing stuff that they love to do.
One more story on that. When I talked about my daughter for my son, I mentioned he was in Boy Scouts. I don't like camping, and you got to do that with Boy Scouts. So when he first joined, I didn't sign up. I just let him say, okay, do his thing and whatever. And then something happened in the summer. They had a week-long summer camp. He went, and the guy that drove him back, he didn't have a cell phone yet. He was 11. And the guy that drove him back didn't call me and tell me that my son was there, and he just left him in the school parking lot. He's an
Oof.
11-year-old. And I went ballistic. I called the scoutmaster, and the scoutmaster said, hey, this guy didn't follow, protocol, but he didn't know and all and everything. And that gave me this thing. I said, well, maybe instead of complaining about it, I should join and sign up. So I did. And back to the strengths thing is I never helped set up the camping gear. I never helped do, all that kind of stuff and load the trailer. But on the flip side, one of the things that scouts had to do, I said, when the rank advancement, is they had to present in front of the parents what they did and why they deserve the rank advancements. I became the coach for that because, as you can tell, you invited me on this. I've taught. That's a strength of mine. And my son really liked that too. And he got into it where he would say, okay, I'm going to be the one who's going to talk in front of the troop. And it led to that improv type of thing. And so recognizing 70% of the kids were introverts and would prefer to just set up the campground. And so that's fine. You just need to do well enough. Some of them, like my son was at the top couple percent for extroversion. I recognized I needed to work with him to say, hey, get in front of everybody, talk, get them motivated, get them excited.
So you waited until 33 to have kids. That's a significantly different path than I had. I think I was 23 when I had my first kid. Tell me about when you did make the decision to go ahead and have your first kid. You said it changed your life. How?
So when I was in my late 20s, my wife didn't tell me this until after my daughter was born. You know, friends of ours that were our age were having kids, and they would come over, or we'd go to theirs. And she said, I'd run the other way, and everything. What happened when my daughter was born is that changed. I embraced it. I would come home. I actually had a job at the Nielsen Company where I was traveling like 30% of the time. I ended up leaving that job, and I took one with a local phone company doing the same sort of thing. It was target marketing, but I only had to travel maybe once a quarter. And that way I could be there when I came home. I could spend time with my daughter and that kind of stuff. She was really into stories when she was 2, 3 years old. I would read to her every single night. And I would, then she would come up with her own stories and we'd play and she'd go through and all this kind of stuff as she got a little older and what have you. And I would just spend a lot of time with her. And, it encouraging the stories. She's still a good storyteller, but encouraging the stories was a good way again to understand where she's coming from, how she thinks, and spend time with her.
I love that because I think it's easy. Let's be honest, a 2 or 3 year old kid, probably, I guess, especially a 3 year old kid, their stories are not interesting most of the time.
Mm-hmm.
I've listened to many a boring story from my kid, but it's cool to see that regardless, you took the time to be present and listen and that became an important experience. It sounds like for both of you. What impact do you think it had investing that time early on in reading to your daughter every night and things like that?
I think she recognizes that, and going a little bit beyond that, I'm willing to listen to her type of thing. And so when she has situations that she's run across in her adult life, she has no problem with saying, hey, I could use somebody to listen and give some advice here. One of the things that both my kids got impacted with this COVID, and you understand because yours would have as well, and
Mm-hmm.
how to deal with that. Well, she was actually an adult at the time because she was 23 when it hit. But what happened is she was in New Zealand. She had a job there. She was working in her field and everything. And all of a sudden, because of COVID, she had to quit the job and come back to the US because she wasn't a New Zealand resident. And that was really hard. She had to give up a job because of it that she liked. She had to move back in with her parents because of forced unemployment and all that kind of stuff. But instead of getting resentful about it, which we may have originally, at one point she just said, can we go out for a walk and talk? And I think we covered 4 miles. And she was explaining that, hey, I been out of university for a year. I had a good job. I had moved out. I was in a different country. I don't want to feel like I'm leeching off my parents. And the fact that she could be open with that, I think is a consequence of those listening to those stories.
Yeah, now she's never going to feel like, oh, I don't want to bug dad with that because he's too busy or he's got more important things to do or that sort of thing. She feels comfortable bringing her challenges to you and talking them through with you, and it sounds like you're able to give her good counsel.
Yep.
It seems like, okay, so if we're looking at it from a principal's perspective, I think the thing to take out of that is it is so important for them to realize that you value communication with them. The same way that
Mhm.
you said your dad talked to you as if you were an adult and things like that, that still impacts you today. Like I can tell when you tell the story that still impacts you. And now your daughter feels comfortable counseling with you with her challenges and things like that, and you're still able to have a big impact on her even as an adult. So as parents, I think we have a million things going on, especially now. We got plenty of distractions. As a parent, you've got a phone in your hand that can certainly take away most of your attention and things like that if you let it. And all the while, your kids are watching how you choose to interact with them, how you choose to be present with them. And you can either shut down communication and really hurt your relationship with that kid and hurt your ability or opportunity to be a resource for them, or you can be present with them, you can give them your full attention, and as a result counsel with them and really help them through challenges in their lives.
You're right.
So let's move forward then. I would love to understand what some of the most fulfilling experiences you've had are as a father. What are your best memories as a dad?
I'll say it's being present for events, but it's not necessarily an event per se. Like, oh, I've been to all my kids' baseball games. It's a turning point or what have you. Like when my son did his first play, I mentioned he's a performer for a living now at age 24. He was like 8 years old. It was an elementary school, a church thing. I really honestly don't remember. But what I do remember was he was so excited about it and how it went and all that kind of stuff. And the fact that I had just been, what did I know? I had just been promoted to director. Things were busy, but I, again, made the time and I went and all that. And it's funny because when he got in high school, I didn't go to every single one of his performances. By then it was more of a routine. But when it's not the routine, when it's something that all of a sudden it's like, oh, it's the first time this has happened or the first time it hits or stuff like that. And so that was an example with him. And in Scouts, it was interesting because at the end, so there's a thing in Boy Scouts, it's called National Youth Leadership Training. You have to show leadership traits and be nominated by like the Scoutmaster to take it because, not everybody's meant to be a leader. And, with his performance in front of the group and that kind of stuff, they recommended it for him. Well, when he did it, he was running it for a week, and it was at a camp in Michigan. I live in the Chicago area. It's a 4-hour drive, and there's an amusement park nearby. And when it was over and I picked him up, I said, "Let's go to the amusement park." And for the first 2 hours, he unloaded on me and all the challenges he had and all that kind of stuff. And I knew that was going to happen. And so I said, "Well, let's go someplace where he's going to like, where, we're not going to a restaurant. We're standing in line waiting for the roller coaster." And then he could talk for a while. We get on the roller coaster, and he forgets about for a while. We get to the next, line and that kind of stuff. So it's when you said things that are stuck with me, it's like I wanted to find a way to make that one an event where he would feel comfortable but not overloaded, where he would talk for 5 minutes while we're in line. We'd get on the ride and then take a little break. Then he'd come back to it. And little by little, he just, get it off his chest.
And I guarantee something that seems like maybe a small scenario or a small act that you did, just taking him to the amusement park, no big deal. I would imagine that's a pretty good memory for him of time he spent with his dad.
I would hope so.
So what's one that you would like to have back? A mulligan where you feel like, hey, I didn't get that right as a dad, and I'd love to go back and redo that.
My son had, again, I told you he was a good student, but he wasn't 3.7 in high school, 95th percentile on a standardized test. But my daughter was more, in reality, she wasn't quite as strong as he was academically, but she did almost as well grade wise. But she was still strong too. She was, she was like 90th percentile or whatever. And there was an online system where, I don't know if you got this for your kids, but like when you're in high school and junior high, at least you could go in and you could see how they were doing for grades and assignments and stuff like that as a parent. And my son was lying to me. He was telling me, "Oh, I finished this assignment," or "I did this." Pretty soon I got a note from the teacher that said he's getting a D in the class. And I told him, "You got to step it up," and everything. And he did. And then he came back and he says, "Well, I did that assignment, but it didn't show up on the thing." I got really mad. I have a front closet that has a mirror glass window in front of it, and I slammed him against it and broke the window and everything like that. And that's what I regret, because I just felt like we've been talking about this. I don't like it when my kids lie to me, and this was important. But the fact that I literally lost it, and that was something, I wish I hadn't done.
So reflecting back on that, then what impact do you think that had on him?
I think he realized how serious it was for me at the time, but I think it was also one of those things where for a while it made him rebellious. He's a teenager, right? And that kind of stuff. And it took a while to get around that. In the long run, it worked out great, because looking back at it is realizing that tells me he wasn't geared for like an academic type field or going to a college or something like that. Even though he had the aptitude for it, it wasn't in his interest set. And finding something different, like the acting type of thing, was there. But you can imagine, as you said, most parents, you mentioned the one with your own son and the bee and fishing and all that kind of stuff, similar type of thing. It was like, looking back at it now, being more mature, I realized, yeah, but he shouldn't have lied to us, but maybe we kind of put him in a position where he didn't feel he could be honest with us.
What do you mean?
Because it was so important for us to say, "Hey, you can be an A student. Why are you screwing up here?" Type of thing.
Got it. So looking back, you feel like maybe you created an environment where it didn't feel safe for him to be honest with you. And so he felt like he needed to lie.
Right.
Do you feel like maybe some trust was lost that had to be built back up after that scenario?
Yeah. And I think it definitely was later on, because it was a realization for me too, because I hadn't gotten that angry with him for a long time.
Yeah. I mean, as parents, we all have those moments that we'd like to have back. We're tired, we're busy, we've got a lot going on, and so we don't always act at our best. I guess maybe my follow-up question to that would be, how did you handle that, knowing that you should have handled it better? How did you earn that trust back?
I think it was just gradual over time of support for other things. He actually did pick it up a little bit and realized, hey, I haven't decided what I want to do in life. And so there was a good side to it from that perspective of saying he got the grades up, like I said, graduated at 3.7. It kept his options
That's
open.
great.
For me, looking back at it, it would have been more like my dad treating me as more as an adult and saying I should have explained to him, look, you've got options in life. You don't want to turn one off at this stage when you're 15 years old.
Yeah. One thing that I've noticed with kids in general, and especially obviously with my kids, because that's the bulk of my experience, is they are quick to forgive if you're willing to own it. Because the
Mhm.
same way that I don't think any of our kids, as much as they would love for us to be perfect, and as much as we'd love to be perfect, I don't think they're under any illusion that we're perfect either. And so being
Mhm.
able to go back and say, "Hey, I wish I would have handled that better. I'm sorry," and showing them an example of how to own your mistakes and things like that. I think they can learn a lot from that as well. And kind of in
Yeah.
my experience, because I haven't batted 1,000, just like nobody else has, that's been a great tool for me as a dad to just say, hey, I made a mistake and I was wrong. And I think I've seen that in my kids that they're more willing to apologize and own mistakes because I've been able to try and model what that could look like for them, and that's gone a long way. On the note of lying, I do think the honesty is such a critical thing to instill in your kids. And so I totally see why you flew off the handle when you felt like he had lied to you. I guess one thing that I feel like was important for us is to let our kids know that they would always be, if they told the truth and they were honest with us, they would be in a lot less trouble than if they lied.
Right.
And so I don't know. Were there those types of things that you tried to go over with your kids as you instilled values with them?
I don't think so. I think it was just more the do by example type of thing. And so that's one of the reasons I considered it a mistake or what have you. I mean, we talked to him about it, but we didn't come back to it. He was in Boy Scouts at the time and they stressed it or what have you. Also for me, and I don't know if it's the same way for you, given that I've had the high income jobs, my wife's more had the hourly, type of stuff, is she was more likely to sit down and instill that kind of stuff with them than I
Mm.
was.
Okay, got you. Well, as you decided to have children and things like that, and prepared for being a dad, were there certain values that you had in mind that I want to make sure that they grow up with these particular things as key components of their lives?
Yeah, I mean, one was work ethic versus entitlement. I mean, I recognize I have to be careful here because there are also like political overtones to this, but I don't mean it in that sense. It's more of a, I grew up in a community, and my wife did too, where nobody cared what you did for a living as long as you had a really strong work ethic. I mean, unless you were selling drugs, right?
Sure.
Type of thing. But and that's how we wanted to treat our kids. And so when COVID hit and my daughter lost her job, in New Zealand solely because of COVID, and she came back, she didn't want to leech off her parents. She got a job at a local paint factory stacking, I don't know, warehouse stuff. And I don't even know totally what she was doing, but it would have been easier for her to sit back and say, oh, I'm going to try to stay in my field. I'm going to focus on that. She couldn't find anything. And she said, okay. By that time, he was 23 or 24. Actually, she just turned 24, and she had said, I don't want to leech off my parents. I'm going to find something. And it's like a real grunt job at a factory for a woman that's 130 pounds, that's lifting heavy stuff and all that kind of stuff. But she did it. And, my son was the same way. For us, that was really important of saying, you're responsible for your own life. Nobody owes you anything. Do the best you can with what you got. And, sometimes you just got to take the hand you're dealt and work with it
How do you teach that?
gradually, through the fact that you recognize certain things that I suppose as a little kid, it's more privileges taken away if you're not doing your share type of stuff,
Mhm.
and as you get older, recognizing the impact on certain things that would happen. Trying to think of a good story here. I think when my son had joined Boy Scouts everybody had to do different things and you were responsible for it and you were assigned it, and everybody loved to cook. A lot of people love to cook, but everybody had to take their turn washing dishes. And that kind of experience for him realized that, look, there's times that it's just part of the job. You got to do what you got to do here. And if you don't do the dishes, well, geez, you're gonna camp out. You're gonna get bugs climbing in there, and it's gonna be worse the next morning. And people are gonna be all over your case. You're gonna lose, respect and all that kind of stuff. So recognizing that, I realized I didn't have to do anything. He learned through that.
One thing that I would like to have back as a dad, as I tried to instill work ethic in my kids, and my kids work hard, so I don't want to insinuate that they don't. But one thing that I learned is it was always more effective to work with them than to say, go clean your room or
Yeah.
go do this chore. If we're working together to clean the kitchen, for example, and we're working alongside them, they're always more willing to buy in and do the work than if you just kind of send them off to do their own thing. And you get things done a lot quicker by yourself sometimes. And I wish I had slowed down at times and worked with them and allowed them to work with me, because I think that has a huge impact on their desire to actually do a good job, is you're right there with them.
Yeah, that's a great point.
So your kids are grown now. You've got adult children. What do you feel like your role is now that they're grown and out of the house and they have their own careers and things like that? What's your role as a father?
Just to listen to them for things, still do stuff together. My son, when he got his first apartment a couple of years ago, we went over and he says, "Hey, come on over. I'll make you guys dinner. We'll play a game, all that kind of stuff." But sometimes he'll reach out. So with part of my son's role, there's a big physical component to it. That what he's doing now is like a Renaissance jousting type of role, and you need to control the horse. You need to be fit and all that. You need to be able to run. And I was a runner in high school. I did track and cross country and stuff, and he did too. But he asked my advice. He says, "Okay, now that I'm not on a team, I need to get good enough in shape. I need to be able to do stuff. I was doing it for health reasons when he was young, and also just I did enjoy like racing and stuff like that in my age group. And so he started asking my opinion as doing it as an adult, because even though he was 24 years old, it was a big difference between 17 and having a team around you and saying, I got to motivate myself, go out and do this. I got to be kind of scientific about it, and saying, okay, great. Let's talk about that.
Okay. So as an analytical guy like yourself, how do you measure success as a father?
Um, I would say about the self-reliance, the work ethic, and also, success in taking the hand you're dealt and being able to make a living with it. I mean, you and I know we've been around long enough to say, yeah, things don't always work. You could do your best and something happens. I've been, for the last 9 years, I've been teaching and running my own business as a consultant. Well, I had one client that, their biggest vertical was cruise lines, and then COVID hit. I was making 10,000 a month off this client. It went away just like that. Not because I wasn't doing good work, not because they didn't want me, but because they just lost 25% of their business, and nothing you could do about it. You just have to take the hand that you're dealt, go out for a good stiff drink, and come back and start over again. And if my kids recognize that, they're going to be a lot more successful in life. They won't need counseling. They'll figure, okay, it's time to bounce back and that kind of thing.
You know what's interesting? What I'm hearing from you, I've heard you say it a couple times now, is just deal with the hand that you're dealt. You can't control your circumstances all the time and things like that. And to me, that exemplifies resilience. And it reminds me of a story that Molly Fletcher, I believe it's Molly Fletcher. She was Tiger Woods' agent a long time ago, and she had lunch with his swing coach, if I'm remembering the story correctly. And she asked him, she said, "Look, you've coached all these different professional golfers. They all can hit the same shots. Like if everybody on the tour can hit a 325, 350 yard drive, whatever. They can hit the fairway. They can sink putts. So what is it that separates somebody like Tiger Woods, the best of the best, not anymore, I guess, but the best of the best, as opposed to just an average golfer?" And it's interesting, the response that he said is, the difference between great and average is the way they respond to adversity. Meaning, when Tiger Woods hits one bad shot, at least back in the day, when he hit one bad shot, it was one bad shot. One bad shot didn't become two bad shots and then three bad shots. He was able to bounce back, shake it off, and roll with the hand that he's dealt. And I think that's so important for us to be able to teach to our kids. And I don't know the perfect answer of how to do it. I think just going through challenges and letting them experience challenges, not removing every obstacle for them, but actually letting them go through some pain and things like that so that they can learn to bounce back and learn that that's not the end of the world. I think as parents, we've got to be super, super diligent and intentional in teaching our kids to be resilient. Any thoughts on how to do that as a dad?
I think what you just hit on is letting them make the mistakes and learn from it. One thing that people knew in the neighborhood where I was growing up, again, it was Ford Motor Company territory. The current Ford Motor Company, which is 123 years old now, which is amazing that a company can do that well. It was Henry Ford's third or fourth company, but he would learn from each one. And he started it when he was 40. And it wasn't that, oh, I just decided to become an entrepreneur at age 40. I'm Henry Ford. It was like, no, he decided at 28 that he'd start a company and things would change and he'd learn from it and so on and so forth. But, he would go back, he would blow off steam, whatever, and then he'd come back and start again and say, okay, recognizing here's what went wrong, enabled him to become head of a company and build it to be, at the time he was last running it, the biggest auto company in the world. General Motors didn't pass him until around the time Henry Ford retired. If he hadn't failed the first few times, it would have never gotten that big. It probably would have succeeded, but it wouldn't have become that big. So it's like your Tiger Woods thing. Ford Motor Company at the time was the most respected auto company in the world. He had done things like, oh, I'm going to go into racing. Well, there wasn't a big market for racing cars, type. It was originally. It was when the Indy 500 started and all that kind of stuff. But it didn't take off, and he recognized, nah, I need a car for the masses. If I'm going to succeed, I can't just have this specialty thing.
That's why I love sports as a teacher so much, because the goal is to learn to win, right? Everybody wants to win. It's high competition, but the consequence is that you also learn how to lose. And I think that's so important for kids to go through loss, go through struggles, and be able to bounce back and things like that. And I think sports is a great, or competition in general is a great teacher of resilience. So let's fast forward. I love asking this question. You're 50 years down the road, and you're no longer around, and your kids are asked to describe your legacy as a father. What do you hope they say?
Oh, that's the one I haven't really thought of. I think it goes back to the thing with my dad in high school, is that, respected them, treated them as an equal human being when they were 10, 15 years old, even though they were still a dependent under you, to be honest.
Well, Dave, I sure appreciate all your insight as a father, as a leader, and it's been really cool to learn from you. Any parting wisdom for any young fathers out there getting ready to start this journey?
Yeah, I guess as a closing comment, it goes back to the strengths of recognizing what they're good at and encouraging it. But also, one thing I didn't say is ensuring they realize it's not an obsession. They still need a sense of humility. You talked about winning and losing. Okay. I don't know who the best baseball player is right now, but, hitters like somebody like Otani, I mean, say he bats 330. Okay, you fail 2/3 of the time,
Yep.
Or if you're Tarek Skubak of the Tigers and you're pitching, I mean, the guy's won the last 2 Cy Young Awards, I think, except, he still loses a quarter of his games, right? It's going to happen. And that keeps you recognizing you're not infallible, a sense of humility. The people that I've seen fail the most in life are the ones that can't admit they could be wrong. I worked with a guy who, when I was doing as a consultant, he was a client of mine, and he'd been very successful. He'd run a successful hedge fund. He'd started a business that had done very well, and he was less likely to listen to me and my experience than somebody who'd failed, because he'd never failed before. And I'm like, well, you brought me in as a predictive analyst, and this is my specialty. But he still felt that he knew things better than I did, even though it was my field and I made a living off of it. And guess what happened? My predictions were right and his were wrong. And the business fell noticeably in terms of revenue. And it wouldn't have happened if he'd had the humility to say, oh, this isn't my field. I know a lot more about the business I'm in than this guy does, but he knows a lot more about analytics, and I should build his analytics in. And so I want to stress that you need to understand your own strengths, but also need to understand if somebody's stronger in an area than you are, listen to their expertise in that area. And my last thing is, a very successful president, in my opinion, was Dwight Eisenhower. And since he's before all our time, when he came out of World War II, he was he's Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces. Then he became president. He took foreign policy. He took the military stuff. He made decisions. But when it came to domestic policy, he's like, I don't understand it as well as my head of commerce. Or when it came to, housing, I don't understand it either. I lived in barracks. He would recognize that at the end of the day, it was his decision, but he would take counsel from the people who, this was their strengths. This is where they succeeded. And he had the humility, even though he was like the most successful military guy of his time, to say, yeah, but that's not my area of expertise. It's theirs. I'm humble enough to know they're better at it than I am. So for your kids, when they learn their strengths and they go into their field, recognize, all right, my son's an actor, but if somebody wants to understand how it gets sold and how to direct it and stuff like that, he should listen, because that's not his strengths.
I appreciate the call out. I think it's so important as a parent to exemplify humility and to teach it in your kids and help them understand that they're not the center of the universe, and they're also not the greatest thing in the universe either. And by learning that, you learn how to actually compliment other people, understand what your strengths are, and recognize that other people can add really big value to you as well. So Dave, thanks so much. Really appreciate your insight, and thanks for joining the Dadical Podcast.
All right. Appreciate it.
That's it for this week's episode. Thanks for listening, and a big thanks to Dave Cameron for his time sharing his insights and letting us learn from him. Big thing that sticks with me is, same as being a leader professionally, being a dad is very similar in the sense that you've got to understand and recognize your kids' strengths, weaknesses, and in order to truly do that, you've got to be present. Once you understand their strengths, you help them lean into those strengths and develop them rather than just focusing on what needs to be fixed. Super grateful to Dave for sharing those insights. Remember, if you know a dad with a story worth sharing, I would love to talk to them. So make sure you go to dadicalpodcast.com and submit the contact form to let me know who I should talk to next. As always, you can follow Dadical Podcast on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and wherever else you might find yourself on socials. Be sure to like and subscribe. Give us a rating and review so other dads who like these conversations can find the podcast as well. And as always, don't sleepwalk through fatherhood. Be Dadical.